Welcome to Washington Times Higher Ground. You have a fascinating journey, Timothy Mahoney. You have been working on a number of films. You have your seventh film coming out. It's Patterns of Evidence: Journey to Mount Sinai Part II. And we're going to talk about that film. But for 20 years now, you've been on a journey of looking for evidence for Scripture, looking at real world evidence to back up the Bible. What is it that initially launched you on that journey?
Well, at first I thought I was just going to go have a wonderful, investigative trip to Exodus, on the story of the Exodus, to Egypt. And what, to my surprise, was when I got there, I was, I never doubted the Bible. I never had a question about whether or not the events happened until I got to Egypt and went to the location where the Israelites were said to have been. And I talked to this Egyptologist, Dr. Manfred, he's an Egyptologist, Manfred BTech. And I said, have you found evidence for the Israelites? And he said, so far not. And for me, Billy, that's when the seed of doubt came into my mind. And I started to have these questions. And it grew through those 3 weeks while I was traveling through Egypt. I went to England, came home, and I had a crisis of faith. And I think maybe I'm not the only person that's ever had a crisis of faith, because I know there's a lot of people, if something comes along in your life and you go, wow, what if this isn't true?
And you had been a lifelong Christian, right? You had grown up in faith, you had heard these stories, you had read scripture, and then to go, thinking, I imagine you went there thinking, oh, I'm going to find evidence of this and it's going to be great and it's going to be easy. And so what happens from there? You come home, you have this crisis of faith because you've gone on quite a journey now, 7 films. Making one film is a miracle, 7 documentaries on this topic. That is massive. But what were the initial steps you took after that crisis of faith?
Well, I've told this story many, many times, but for those who've never heard it before, was that I sat in an edit suite, and I often had to work, because this project, when I first was working on it, was just a part-time project. It wasn't a full-time investigation. And I was doing other work. And so on weekends, I would come in and I was looking at this footage, logging all of it. And I remember looking at this interview at this dig site, because I actually went to a dig site, and I had heard that there was evidence that was in this area. So for the Israelites. And then when I got there, when he said, no, so far not, that's what shook me so much. And I was looking at Manfred BTech, and I was looking at the footage, and I was actually praying, said, you've got to explain this to me. Why in the world would this man who's been there for 20 some years digging is telling me he can't find any evidence? Later, I'd find out that there was more behind the scenes than I knew. But when he told me that, as I was watching that, I actually started to, to crying out to God, because I knew I was at this moment where I was trying to believe, well, I believe the Bible, but this man's saying there's no evidence for it. And there's like a chill that came into the room, a cold chill. And I felt it. And this thought came in from this side of my brain: everything that your family has believed about the Bible is a lie. That your mother believed, that your grandmother believed. And this sense of absolute despair came over me, that it was like hopelessness.
That'll rock you to your core. I mean, that will rock you to your core. That's everything you've ever known and believed. And what you said there about your mother, your grandmother, going back generations, feeling as though, have I been believing a lie this whole time? I can't imagine how emotionally unsettling that must have been.
Absolutely. And what happened was, my mother had put great faith, and there's a backstory. And I actually made another movie called The Journey Home, because during the making of these films, people would ask me the same question you're asking. Well, why is it that this was so significant to you? And my mother, in our family, I was the oldest of 4 children. We literally had to flee my father. One day, it had been building up, and my father had a lot of trauma in his life, and he was a vet. He was a police officer, and he was losing it. And he had threatened to kill the family. And that was something I never talked about until the last year. And I never revealed any of this. But my mother would have us on our knees praying to God for our safety. And one day, when I was 11 years old, I remember coming home, seeing my mother out in the running to a car with suitcases and baskets, my uncle. And he came to pick us up because she thought today's the day I need to escape. And we went into hiding. So my mother believed that God was the God of the Bible, and that when things, we had a little children's storybook that she would read to us. And so she put great faith in God and Jesus, and that he would protect us. So when we left that day, when that was the end of our family, all those dependencies upon the Lord were a part of my heritage. And so for me to have this thought come in, and I think it was you've dealt with this in the past, but I think it was something dark. It was a spiritual attack that came to me, and that dark attack was real, and I felt it physically. It was like a cold chill. Then this other thought came into my side, another there's two different voices standing, two different beings in between me, and the other one said, "Stop editing, get up, go to your office." Was that authoritative? And I walked to my office. Go to your bookcase. And I walked to my bookcase, read that book. And I pulled this book out, and I got it in the other room. And it was Pharaohs and Kings. And a friend of mine, John, had sent it to me. He was a musician, and he said, "I really think you need to read this book." But he gave it to me a year earlier. And I have lots of books. And I looked at it, and I didn't take him up on it. I should have read that book. It would have saved me a lot of time, But I read it, and here, this man, Egyptologist David Roll, had been talking and had been looking at Manfred Bitech's work. And he had basically been showing a pattern of evidence, but earlier in time. Now, the place that I went was underneath. If I'm drawing a line of time here, Ramesses, the city of Ramesses, is where the Bible tells us that the Israelites lived. But underneath that city is an older city down here, and that's the city of Avaris. It was a city upon a city, an ancient city earlier in time. And what Manfred was digging, he was digging the Avaris city. And this is where the pattern was coming from, the pattern of the arrival of the Israelites, of their growing into a large group, of their slavery, of the punishment of Egypt. It was all earlier in time. And David Roll was saying, hey, this matches the biblical text. But Billy,
wow,
David wasn't a believer. He was an agnostic. So it wasn't like he was trying to prove anything.
And so, you start to discover this. God obviously gives you that message. You go, you read the book, you start to see this. Now you engage in your own investigation, which again has spanned 7 films now. And I know there's probably a million more films coming because you are prolific on this subject matter. As you started to get into these investigations and make these films, what started to happen to that doubt that you were feeling before?
Well, it was starting to be erased. And I think that's why this whole new film, Journey to Mount Sinai, I started to see that, all of us are on this journey. The Israelites were on a journey back in the past, and I'm going to take you through that journey. But I was on a journey too, spiritually. I was on a journey from the time of my childhood when my mother introduced me to faith, when I accepted Christ as my personal Savior as a young boy, and then growing up as a teen. But now I'm on a different journey. I'm on a journey of adulthood, and I'm investigating, and I'm taking the Bible, and I'm putting it at risk. I'm putting the Bible at risk because it's already at risk. There's already millions and probably billions of people that don't believe that the events of the Bible happen. And why is that? Is because there are people who have gone out and looked, and they've not found evidence where they've looked. So they said, well, it didn't happen. So our films ask the question, well, what is the Bible actually saying? And we're treating it as a historical document. And then we're saying, are we looking in the right place? And are we looking in the right time? And that's the reason, Billy, why a pattern of evidence is a really cool technique, because it's a scientific technique. And you can look at an event, and in the latest film, I've got a scorecard here. And this scorecard is what is the events of the Bible, and then I'm checklisting all the way through. So this is the Mount Sinai scorecard. It's like bowling for the Bible. you know, and you can look at these places and you can say, hey, can I give this a yes, a maybe, or a no? So as we go into these investigations, that's what we're doing. We're saying, well, let's look at the different points of view and let's see if the pattern from what the Bible is telling us can be found at this location.
Well, and in Patterns of Evidence Journey to Mount Sinai Part 2, there was obviously a Part 1. And in both of these films, you're looking at different locations. You're using that scorecard, that scientific method you just described, and you're assessing Mount Sinai, right? The location of it. But for people who don't know, because I think the other problem we have right now is a lot of people are Bible illiterate. If you look at the numbers, George Barna is telling us that only 4% of Americans have a biblical worldview. That's pretty shocking, down from 6% in 2020, which 6% was bad. Now we're down to 4. People don't know. So when it comes to Mount Sinai, can you explain to us why is that a significant location, not just for Christians, but obviously for Jews and really all of humanity?
Well, what happened here is that if we read the narrative, God chose Mount Sinai. He probably could have chosen anywhere, but why did he choose it? He chose it as a place to reveal himself first to Moses. Moses was out in the land of Midian, and that's one of our checklists here, was where's the land of Midian? He was there, he lived there for 40 years. And if people are biblically illiterate, if they don't know who Moses was, but he was actually an Egyptian slave. I mean, he could have been because his family were Egyptian slaves, but he was rescued by a princess, the Bible tells us, and he was raised in Pharaoh's court and became a prince of Egypt, as it were. And many might have seen Spielberg's, movie Prince of Egypt. That's probably as close culturally as they get to the idea of who Moses was. But Moses and the Ten Commandments, oftentimes Cecil B. DeMille has had that film playing for many, many years. Probably, I don't know, 60 years every year. That's about as close to the Bible as many people get looking at those films. But Moses then, he kills an Egyptian and he flees to this place called Midian. And there he marries the daughter of Jethro. And for 40 years, he's tending sheep. And one day he sees a bush burning at a mountain. And at this, he goes to it and he hears a voice speak to him. And the voice says, "You're on holy ground. Take off your shoes." And then God proceeds to tell him that God has heard the cries of his of his family, his ancestry, his descendants there. And he wants Moses to go back to Pharaoh and bring these people to Mount Sinai. Why is it significant? Is because this event is recorded very, clearly in the Bible. And those details explain the journey, the route, wildernesses, and events, supernatural events. And then it explains the mountain. And there's details within that mountain. But why is that significant? Is that the God's laws were given to Moses at that mountain, and the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, they marry God. They make a covenant, and they say, "We're going to be your people." And this is fulfilling then the promise that earlier on Abraham had. Abraham was considered the father of actually two nations, or many nations, I should probably say, because Ishmael was one of his descendants, and a lot of Arab people look that they're connected to Ishmael, and then we've got the Jewish descendants coming from Jacob. And then Esau is also part of this. So there's this great big history. That's why this is so important for people to understand the Middle East and to understand the Bible. And at Mount Sinai, to give you a summary of this, is that God gives the commandments, these commandments that are for I think you could say they're for all mankind. They should be, but people don't want them. They don't want necessarily to obey God's commandments. But a lot of this all happens at this mountain. And so that's why there's been such an interest in it. And people haven't known where it was. So you say, Tim, well, why am I involved? Well, in some ways, I'm not sure, but I think it's something I was supposed to do. And but there are people that say that this is a fairy tale. And when you send your kids off to university or out into the world, they are told that, you shouldn't really believe these things. These commandments from the Bible are not real; they're made up. That this event didn't really happen, and there's no reason why you should have any faith at all in this. You should free yourself from that. And
And
I
that was
think that
something you were at risk of even when you had that doubt. You were at a crossroads when you experienced that doubt, right? You could have gone down the Richard Dawkins route, or you could have gone down the route you've taken, which was to investigate, explore, and then beyond that, make films to help other people investigate and explore. And your faith has strengthened as a result of that, which I find incredibly fascinating.
Well, thank you. I agree with that, and I get we have thousands of comments, and we've had people literally. One man was going to commit suicide, and he decided to before he did, he'd watch a movie, and he just searching around, and finally he found one of our films, and he watched it, and the despair that he felt, the hopelessness, and everything. Once he watched our film, he goes, "Wait a minute." There is a God and he does care and he's given us his word. I think he saw the Moses controversy, which is about God giving us his word and the alphabet. So, yes, there are so many people that want, that's why these films are significant, because these people want to believe that there's something they can believe in and that it's a sure, that there's a foundation. And Moses gives us Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible. We know about our origin because of what happened. And these books were written during this time. This information was given to us at this time. And it's helpful. It's not only helpful, but it's absolutely necessary if we're going to, if we understand what the Bible is telling us, that there is a God and that he has created us to worship him. And the world is wanting us to worship everything else. So these are serious questions that every individual needs to answer. And that's why I think these films are important because of that, because of that reality that I had one businessman, I showed him this stuff and he said to me after he looked at it, and it was a profound statement. He says, if this is true, it changes everything.
Isn't that amazing? And even for Christians who know it's true and others who know it's true, to still have that feeling, right? Because I think everybody has those questions in the back of their mind. We believe it's true, but you want the evidence. You want to know. You want to see. You want to experience. And so, my final question for you, as we are looking at this, the film hits theaters May 15th and May 17th. Again, it's Patterns of Evidence: Journey to Mount Sinai Part II. This is a simple question for you. Based on working on film 1 and film 2, do you feel like you have a solid idea of where you think Mount Sinai is?
I do. I mean, at the end of this investigation, I actually filled out this chart. I've never done this before, and I'm going to share with the audience where I think the evidence is leaning. And you can't mark off 100% on everything, but you can get a good sense of direction from this investigation. And I want to say this: you need to see this movie in the cinema. I've worked on many films. The Edit Suite, I have big screens. When I see the film in the cinema, it's a different experience. You're going to be a part of an immersive experience when you watch this film. You might be probably standing in the same location, potentially, if this is all correct, that the Israelites stood. And those mountains haven't changed. You're going to be able to have that sense of being there, because many people will never be able to go to these places. But I'm going to take you there, and you're going to have an experience that you would never have had before. And this film then ends on a note of praise and worship, because that's what the Israelites were to do. They were to worship God at this mountain. And I'm going to have a bonus section added to this film where we're going to have that opportunity. And I think it's going to be very, very special, and you do not want to miss that event. Could I tell people how to get tickets?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, there's 2 ways. If you've ever been to a Fathom event, there's Fathom Events, fathomevents.com. And then you can go to Journey to Mount Sinai. You'll see it there on the page. And then you just type in your zip code and it'll tell you where the theater is. Another way is to go to patternsofevidence.com, patternsofevidence.com. And once again, you're going to be able to watch a trailer there and then get your tickets. You can download the scorecard. It'll be there. It'll prep you. It's got a lot of information on that. And I just am thankful that we were able to get to this. May 15th, 2003. That was an interesting date because I was leaving Saudi Arabia. I had no idea when I booked this film, May 15th, would be exactly 20 years later. So I'm celebrating a 20-year milestone from leaving Saudi Arabia to the last part of the investigation to now putting it in the theaters 20 years later.
Well, I want to thank you for making these films, and people can go to your website, obviously, see your past films as well. Go to the theater May 15th and 17th for Patterns of Evidence, Journey to Mount Sinai, Part 2. Thank you so much for joining Higher Ground. Appreciate it today.
Oh, thank you, Billy.